Simon & Schuster Audio presents Star Trek: The Next Generation, Relics by Michael Jan Friedman. Based on the television episode story and teleplay by Ronald D. Moore. Read by James Doohan, with an introduction and conclusion by LeVar Burton.
It's easy to idealize the past. Take sailing ships, for instance. Not the big, hard-hulled vessels we use today to travel through subspace from one star system to another. No, I'm talking about the clumsy, little wooden canvas jobs men used in the old days to navigate their planet's oceans. When I was young, I liked to imagine myself at the helm of one of those ships. The wind singing in my ears, the taste of salt spray on my lips. I liked to pretend that I was on some long, secret voyage, sent off by a beautiful queen. There was always a beautiful queen, it seemed, braving impossible dangers to explore lands no one had ever seen before. It was all stirring, very romantic. Of course, if my dreams had been a little more historically accurate, I probably wouldn't have come back alive from any of those voyages. In those days, sailors often didn't. If the scurvy didn't get them, there was a host of other diseases waiting in the wings, not to mention starvation, dehydration, and the occasional hurricane. Then I got older, and my dreams came to revolve around more recent times. I imagined myself on board some early starship back in the days when everything was theoretical and experimental, and nobody was quite sure their shiny new machines would work the way they were supposed to. But I didn't dream that I was at the helm any longer, or even in charge. In those older, more mature dreams, I was the ship's engineer, the guy everyone turned to when things started to fall apart, the guy who could always figure out a way to do what needed to be done. Of course, it wasn't all romance and adventure in those days either, but the casualties were a lot fewer and the problems were a good deal more interesting. And so, when I took the entrance exams for Starfleet Academy, I wasn't aspiring to be Geordi LaForge captain. All I wanted was to be Geordi LaForge chief engineer. Then I could be one of those guys who put everything back together when it began to fall apart, just like in the good old days when they were still just feeling their way through the galaxy. Yeah, it's easy to idealize the past until you smack into it at warp 9.95.
Captain Picard?
Jean-Luc Picard was in his ready room studying a monograph on the formation of accretion bridges in binary star pairs. Yes, Mr. Data?
Sir, there is something here that you should see.
I'm on my way. Rising, the captain rounded his desk and headed for the exit. Mr. Data would not have summoned him unless this were a matter of some urgency. As the ready room door slid aside, he noted that Will Riker, his first officer, was already hovering over Data's position at the aft science station. A moment later, he joined them.
What is it, Data?
A subspace radio wave, sir. I have identified the signal. The transmission appears to be a Starfleet code used between 50 and 80 years ago. Code 1 Alpha 0. Ship in distress. Riker was intrigued.
Computer, are there any Starfleet vessels reported missing in this sector?
Negative.
It was the captain's turn to pose a question. Computer, expand parameters to include adjacent sectors. A list of ships came up on one of the monitors.
Transport ship SS Jenolan, NC-567, was reported missing on stardate 7893.1 while en route to Norpin 5.
Riker exchanged glances with the captain.
75 years ago, sir. I'd say we found the Jenolan. But we're a long way from Norpin 5. They must have gone pretty far off course.
Indeed, Number One. Picard turned to Tina Rager, the petite black woman sitting at the con station.
Ensign, establish coordinates for the source of the signal and plot a course for them. Warp factor 8. Aye, sir. Warp factor 8, Captain. Why the hurry, sir?
The captain frowned, his first officer had a point. If the Janolan had waited for 75 years, it could wait a little longer, and yet... Call it intuition, number one. Will Riker drummed his fingers on the armrest of his seat in the command center. For 4 days, they'd been riding through subspace, heading for a rendezvous with what was left of the Janolan.
Captain.
It was Worf. Turning away from the science console, Picard answered him. Yes, Lieutenant?
We are approaching the coordinates of the distress signal.
Picard turned to Ensign Rager. Bring us out of warp, Ensign. Aye, sir. Riker stood. He got antsy whenever the ship was about to close in on its objective, particularly one it had been pursuing as long as this one. Unfortunately, the main view screen showed nothing except an unfamiliar star field. They were still millions of kilometers short of the signal source, which they would now approach on impulse power. Suddenly, the Enterprise was rocked, as if a giant hand had grasped it and was shaking it like a tambourine. Riker grasped at the back of Rager's chair to keep from being catapulted across the deck. Then, as abruptly as it started, the shaking stopped. But that was no guarantee that they wouldn't be treated to a repeat performance.
Yellow alert.
As Riker headed back to his place in the command center, Picard and Data were barely a step behind him. The captain glanced at Worf. Report, Lieutenant.
We have entered a massive gravitational field, sir.
Picard frowned, and he wasn't the only one. After all, there was nothing on the screen close enough to possess a gravitational field, much less one as powerful as the thing they'd run into. Riker turned to the android second officer, hoping for more information. Data was bent over the ops station, having replaced the crewmen who had been sitting there before.
Mr. Data?
Commander, there are no stellar bodies listed at these coordinates in our charts. However, sensor readings indicate the presence of an extremely strong gravitational source in this vicinity. It is directly ahead. It didn't make sense, Riker thought, unless the object creating the field was cloaked somehow. Picard must have had the same idea. Mr. Worf, can you localize the source of the gravity field?
Yes, sir.
On screen. The star field on the view screen changed, reflecting another view, and if one looked closely, there was a small dark ball at its center. The captain turned to Worf again. Magnify, Lieutenant. The image increased several orders of magnitude, until it could be seen more easily. It now appeared as round and smooth as a billiard ball, but because it was so dark, it was hard for Riker to discern anything else about it.
Sensors?
Data swiveled in his chair. I am having difficulty scanning the object. However, it would appear to be at least 200 million kilometers in diameter. Riker looked to Picard. The captain's surprise mirrored his own. Sir, that's almost the size of Earth's orbit around the sun. Indeed, number one. Why didn't we detect it before now? Any idea, Data? Captain, the object's enormous mass is causing a great deal of gravimetric subspace interference. That interference might have prevented our sensors from detecting the object before we dropped out of warp. Picard's brow wrinkled as he gazed at the view screen. Mr. Data, could this be a Dyson sphere? There is no comparative data, Captain. However, this object does fit the general parameters of Dyson's theory. Riker looked from one to the other. A Dyson sphere? It's a very old theory, number one. I'm not surprised that you haven't heard of it. A 20th century physicist, Freeman Dyson, postulated that an enormous hollow sphere could be constructed around a star. This would have the advantage of harnessing all the radiant energy of the star, not just a fraction of it. A population living on the interior surface would therefore have a virtually inexhaustible source of power. Are you saying there might be people living in there? The answer was supplied by Data. Possibly a great number of people, Commander. The interior surface area of a sphere this size would be equivalent to that of more than 250 million Class M planets. Worf looked up from his tactical console.
Sir, I have located the distress signal. It is coming from a point on the northern hemisphere.
Absorbing the information, Picard turned to Rhaegar. Ensign, take us into synchronous orbit above that point. Aye, sir. They still had to answer the 75-year-old distress call, Riker mused. But their interest in the Janolan had already paled beside their interest in the sphere. Gradually, they pulled closer to it, until they at last achieved the synchronous orbit that Picard desired. The monstrous object looked like a giant wall in space, stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. Where before the sphere had appeared perfectly smooth, it was now possible to discern intricate patterns on the surface. We are holding position at 30,000 kilometers above the surface, Captain. Thank you, Ensign. Sir? Yes, Mr. Data? The distress signal is coming from a Federation ship which has impacted on the surface of the sphere. It is the transport ship Janolan. Riker nodded. Any life signs? Our sensors show none, sir. However, there are several small power emanations, and life support is still functioning at minimum levels. Out of the corner of his eye, Riker noticed Picard looking at him. Knowing exactly what the captain wanted, the first officer tapped his communicator. Bridge to engineering. Geordi, meet me in transporter room 3. Then he turned to the Klingon security chief. Mr. Worf, you're with me as well. As Geordi materialized on the Janolan with Riker and Worf on either side of him, he scanned their surroundings. Huh. A bit cramped, isn't it? Riker took out his tricorder. Come on, let's have a look at it. The lights were dim. One or two of the consoles were damaged or burnt out. There were piles of ash on the floor, and in several spots the bulkhead was caved in. Geordi shook his head as he took it all in. This ship really went through the ringer even before it crashed. Wonder what happened to it. Sniffing the air, Riker turned to the Klingon. Pretty stale in here. See if you can increase the oxygen level, Lieutenant. Nodding, Worf moved over to one of the consoles. Meanwhile, Geordi's tricorder led him to the transporter controls. Not that he expected to find anything of interest there, but he had to cover all the bases. A moment later, he was glad he had. Commander? What is it, Geordi? This transporter is still online. It's being fed power from the auxiliary systems. Riker bent over the transporter controls to do some checking of his own. How about that? The materialization subroutine has been disabled. And that's not all. The auxiliary phase inducers have been connected to the emitter array. The override is completely gone, and the pattern buffer's been locked into a continuous diagnostic cycle. That doesn't make any sense. Locking the unit in a diagnostic mode just sends inert matter flowing through the pattern buffer. Suddenly, Geordi saw something on the console. Something he hadn't noticed before. Damn. Someone's pattern is still in the buffer. Riker's eyes narrowed as he followed Geordi's pointing finger. You're right. It's completely intact. Less than 0.003 signal degradation. But how is that possible? Geordi shrugged. I don't know.
I've never seen a transporter system jury-rigged like this.
Riker frowned.
Geordie, could someone survive in a transporter buffer for 75 years?
The chief engineer bit his lip. It had never been attempted, not to his knowledge anyway. But
I know a way to find out, Commander.
ever so carefully, Geordie worked the controls of the transporter unit. Then, taking a deep breath, he touched one final command area and looked to the tiny platform in front of him. In the next instant, he saw a figure taking shape. It wavered in the beam, acquiring a density at a snail's pace, and then, with a last surge of energy, solidified. Riker shook his head in admiration.
My God, Geordie, you did it!
And so he had. For what stood before them was a living, breathing denizen of the 23rd century. And except for the arm he held in a sling, he was hardly the worse for wear. For a moment, Montgomery Scott was overcome by a wave of vertigo. He didn't know who he was, much less where he was. Then, it all came flooding back to him. He was in the Janolan, in the Ops Center. They'd crashed. Only he and Ensign Franklin had survived. And with a dearth of supplies staring them in the face, their only hope had been... He looked around. There were two men standing in front of the transporter platform, staring at him. One of them, the shorter of the two, wore a strange, high-tech band around his eyes. Both sported uniforms that he had never seen before, but they'd rescued him from the transporter loop, so they probably weren't hostile. The transporter loop, he thought. Franklin. Where was Franklin? Shaking off his wooziness, Scott came down off the platform and headed straight for the transporter console. Seemingly fascinated by him, the two men stepped aside to let him bustle by. No sooner had Scott reached the console than he began checking out its monitors, verifying his readings.
We've got to get Franklin out of there.
One of the men spoke up.
Someone else's pattern is still in the buffer? Aye. Matt Franklin and we went in together.
Almost done, he told himself. Another couple of levels to examine. Here. And here. And then he'd... Wait a minute. Scott stared at the last monitor, the one that covered the inducers. He didn't like this.
Something's wrong. One of the inducers has failed.
Turning to the man in the band, he barked an order.
Boost the gain on the matter stream.
Moving to a nearby console, the man complied, apparently unhampered by the thing on his face.
Come on, Franklin. Don't give up. I know you're in there. I can hear your electrons buzzing.
Scott's mouth had gone dry, so dry he could barely swallow. He worked furiously at his instruments, certain that he could perform just one more miracle. After all, he'd pulled Jim Kirk's bacon out of worse fires. And then he saw it. Franklin's signal profile. No, he thought. Oh, Lord, no. When he finally tore his eyes away, they were moist with sorrow.
It's no use. The signal pattern's been degraded by 53%. He's gone.
The last two words seemed to reverberate through the Ops Center. The man in the band frowned and looked away. The taller man took a step forward.
I'm sorry. So am I, lad. So am I. I'm Commander William Riker, First Officer of the Starship Enterprise.
At the name, Scott felt something rise within him, a gladness that, just for a second or two, made him forget his sorrow.
The Enterprise, eh? I should have known. And I'll bet it was Jim Kirk himself who hauled the old girl out of mothballs to come looking for me.
He wondered just when Starfleet had started outfitting its officers in these skin-tight suits. There was barely enough room in them to hide a wart.
The name's Captain Montgomery Scott. How long have I been missing?
Riker looked at his companion. The man in the band just shrugged.
This may seem something of a shock, Captain Scott, but it's been a good, sir.
The word had been spoken by someone with a deep voice, a very deep voice. Scott, like the others, turned in response and found himself staring at a savage, bony-browed Klingon, the same sort of villain who'd tried to take his life time and again when he'd served under Kirk. And impossible as it seemed, the bloody heathen was wearing the same kind of uniform as Commander Riker. Did that mean... could it possibly mean... Unperturbed, the Klingon addressed the first officer.
I have restored life support, sir. The oxygen levels will return to normal shortly.
Riker acknowledged the information with a nod, then turned to the newcomer.
Captain Scott.
Scott saw Riker looking down at him. The man seemed sympathetic.
Aye, lad. This is Lieutenant Worf.
Scott sighed. He'd been hoping there was some other explanation. The first officer put a hand on his shoulder.
Captain Scott, perhaps there are a few things we should talk about.
Scott turned to him, feeling very much upstream without a paddle.
Aye, and perhaps more than a few.
It took a while for them to brief him on the truth, and a lot longer before he could even come close to accepting it. My God, thought Scott. 75 years. 75 years. Geordi and his fellow officers were halfway to the transporter room exit when they realized they'd left Captain Scott standing on the platform behind them. The man was gazing at the overhead transporter elements, muttering to no one in particular.
Well, you've changed the resonator array. Only 3-phase inverters.
Geordi saw the first officer turn to him.
Mr. LaForge, I think our guest is going to have a lot of questions. Don't worry, sir. I'll take care of him.
Glancing at Scott one last time, Riker gestured for Worf to accompany him. Together, they left the transporter room. Meanwhile, Scott had moved off and was scrutinizing the optical data chips set into the bulkhead. Suddenly, his features took on an almost horrified cast.
Of all the... What have you done to the duotronic enhancers?
Geordi smiled.
Those were replaced with isolinear chips about 40 years ago. It's a lot more efficient now. Aye, I'm sure of that.
Geordi gestured to the exit.
Shall we?
Still a little dazed, Scott followed him out into the corridor. Here, too, Scott's eyes scanned everything in sight. He was consumed by curiosity.
You were saying that you were on your way to the Norpin colony when you had a warp engine failure? Aye, that's right. We had an overload in one of the plasma transfer conduits. The captain brought us out of warp, we hit some gravimetric interference, and then there it was, as big as life.
He pointed to a raised portion of the bulkhead.
Is that a conduit interface? Yep. There it was. The Dyson sphere. Right? Aye, it was amazing. An actual Dyson sphere. Can you imagine the engineering skills needed to even design such a structure?
But his attention wasn't on his recollections of the sphere. It was on a wall panel a couple of meters up ahead. Suddenly he moved up to it and pulled the panel off its place in the bulkhead. Geordie was uncertain that Scott knew what he was doing, but out of courtesy, he didn't make a move to stop him.
Liquid state energy transfer. No power lines at all. This looks like an optical data conduit. Be careful there, Captain Scott. That's no data conduit. It's an EPS power tap.
Gently wresting the panel from Scott, he replaced it on the wall.
Tell me more about the Dyson sphere. What happened when you first approached it?
Scott shrugged. Up ahead, a turbolift station was coming into view.
We began a standard survey of the surface, of course. We were just completing the initial orbital scan when our aft power coil suddenly exploded. We tried to compensate with the ventral relays, but there wasn't time enough. The ship got caught in the sphere's gravity well, and down we went. Why? It's a miracle the ship's superstructure survived a crash like that. It nearly didn't. Franklin and I were the only ones that lived to tell the tale. Everyone else was killed by the impact.
Geordie tried to imagine the man's feelings when he realized he'd survived, but that so many others had perished.
What made you think of using the transporter's pattern buffer to stay alive?
Scott shook his head.
We didn't have enough supplies to wait for a rescue, so I had to think of something. But locking it into a diagnostic cycle to keep the signal from degrading and cross-connecting the phase inducers to provide a regenerative power source. It's brilliant.
The older man frowned.
I'm afraid it's only 50% brilliant, lad. Ensign Franklin deserved better.
Noting the man's sadness, Geordie changed the subject to something Scott could get excited about.
I think you're going to like the 24th century, Captain Scott. We've made some pretty amazing advances in the last 80 years.
It worked. Scott seemed to perk up a bit as they entered the turbolift. Looking around the compartment, he nodded approvingly.
Aye, from what I can see, you've got a fine ship here, Mr. LaForge. It's a real beauty, in fact. I must admit to being a mite overwhelmed.
Geordie grinned.
Wait till you see the holodeck.
Scott gave him a look of mingled surprise and curiosity.
The holodeck? So, what do you think, lass?
Beverly Crusher, Chief Medical Officer of the Starship Enterprise, looked down at her latest patient and shook her head.
Well, you're a treasure, Captain Scott. An absolute treasure. The only person ever to spend 75 years cycling around in a transporter and live to tell of it. Now, hold still, will you?
Sitting on a biobed in sickbay, Scott winced as the doctor examined his injured limb.
It's easy for you to say, lass. Your arm has nae been broken for the last 75 years.
Crusher glanced at Geordie, who'd escorted Captain Scott to sickbay. Geordie shrugged. Turning back to her tricorder readouts, Crusher considered the information there.
You've got a hairline fracture of the humerus, Captain. It'll ache for a few days, but after that, it should be fine. Thank you, lass.
Scott turned to Geordie.
Well, I'll say this for your enterprise. The doctors are a fair sight prettier than what I'm used to.
Crusher couldn't help but smile.
Flattery will get you nowhere, Captain.
Before Scott could reply, the sickbay doors opened to admit another visitor. This time, it was the man in charge of the Enterprise. Dutiful as ever, Geordie made the introduction.
Captain Scott, this is Captain Picard.
Picard extended his hand.
Jean-Luc Picard, Captain Scott. Welcome aboard.
Scott clasped the captain's hand as warmly as it was offered.
Thank you, sir. Of all the ships that could have found me, I'm glad it was yours. But if you do not mind, call me Scotty. Very well. How are you feeling, Scotty? Good question. How am I feeling, Doctor?
Crusher slipped her tricorder into her pocket.
Well, other than a couple of bumps and bruises and a slightly battered arm, I'd say you feel fine for a man of 147. How about that, Captain? And I do not feel a day over 120.
Picard smiled politely.
I must say, I was surprised when Commander Riker told me you were aboard the Janolan. Our records didn't list you as one of their crew.
Scott frowned ever so slightly.
I wasn't actually a member of the crew, sir, truth to tell. I was just a passenger. I was heading for Norpin 5, you see, to settle down and enjoy my retirement.
If Picard had a reaction to that, he didn't show it.
I see. Well, I would very much enjoy the opportunity to discuss your career at some point. History is one of my hobbies, and I'm sure you have some fascinating insights into the events of your time. Oh, I don't know if you'll call them fascinating exactly, but I'd be happy to answer your questions. I look forward to it.
Then he glanced at Geordi.
Commander, we need to begin a full analysis of the Dyson sphere. I'll get right on it, sir.
The captain nodded approvingly, then returned his attention to their guest.
Again, welcome aboard, Captain Scott.
And with that, Picard took his leave of them. Geordi turned to Scott.
You heard the captain. I have to get back to engineering to start that analysis.
Scott's face lit up.
Engineering, lad? Oh, thought you'd never ask.
And before Crusher could stop him, he'd moved down off the biobed to accompany Geordi.
Just a minute, Captain. Exactly where do you think you're going?
Scott looked at the doctor, puzzled.
What is it, lass? You finished your tests, have you not? True, but you've had quite a shock to your system. The first thing you're going to do is to get some rest.
Scott seemed on the verge of protesting until Geordi intervened.
We're pretty busy right now anyway, Captain Scott, but I'd be happy to give you a tour of engineering a little later, when the doctor says it's okay.
Scott looked from one of them to the other. Faced with uniform resistance, he sighed.
Aye, when the doctor says it's okay.
Geordi smiled.
Great. See you then. Here we are, Captain Scott.
The ensign assigned to show Scott to his quarters stopped in front of a door halfway down the corridor from the turbolift.
After you, sir.
Nodding, Scott took a step forward. The door opened to reveal the quarters that had been set aside for him.
Good Lord, man. Where have you put me?
The ensign turned to stare at him.
Well, these are standard guest quarters, sir. I can try to find something bigger, if you wish.
Scott's eyes widened.
Bigger? You misunderstand me, lad. Why, in my day, even admirals didn't have such quarters on a starship. And the only person who ever complained was the dolman of Elas. You never heard such whining from a grown woman in all your life. Right, sir. You'll find the closet back there with a full wardrobe in your size, and this is the food replicator, and your computer terminal.
But Scott wasn't paying very close attention. Again, he was dredging up memories.
You know, these quarters remind me of a hotel room I once had on Argelius. Oh, now there was a planet. Everything a man could want right at his fingertips. Of course, on our first visit, I ran into a wee bit of trouble there, but... excuse me, sir, I have to return to duty.
Scott focused on his companion and frowned. What a fool he'd been. The ensign wasn't interested in the dolmen of Elas or the accommodations on Argelius or any other stories he had to tell. He just wanted to get on with his business.
Sorry to trouble you, Ensign. No trouble at all, sir.
A moment later, the door closed behind the man, and Scott was alone. He sighed and sat down on the overstuffed couch they'd given him and looked around. Then he sighed again. Suddenly, he felt very, very lost. Down in engineering, a handful of men and women were working at consoles and checking displays. Geordi was all but oblivious to the activity, however. He was carrying out a task of his own.
Commander LaForge?
He looked up and saw Bartell, a tall blonde woman, standing at the entrance to his office.
Come on in, Bartell. I've got a job for you.
The chief engineer swiveled his monitor around so Bartell could get a look at the graphic on it.
The bridge wants a complete spectrographic scan of the sphere, and we'll need all the sensors to be synchronized. Of course, I can't recalibrate the aft array with the warp engines in operation, so I need you to shut them down for the time being.
Bartell smiled.
Consider it done, sir.
As she headed for the engine core, Geordi went back to work on his terminal. Truth to tell, he was eager to perform this spectrographic analysis. He was as curious about the sphere as anyone else. In fact, he was so intent on setting up the scan that he barely heard the sudden outbreak of conversation outside. But as it got closer and closer to his office, he found himself increasingly distracted by it. Picking his head up, he saw Bartell blocking someone's way, and that someone was Montgomery Scott.
Can I help you, sir? I didn't think so, lass, but I'll let you know.
Geordi scowled as he watched Captain Scott cut a swath through engineering. Sighing, Geordi moved to intervene. By the time he did so, Bartell was trying to interpose herself between Scott and the warp core.
Sir, this area is off limits. It's restricted to...
Geordi waved her off.
It's all right, Bartell. I'll handle it.
As Bartell left them alone, Geordi considered his unexpected visitor. The man was slowly circling the warp core, taking everything in.
Captain Scott, this really isn't a very good time.
Scott turned to him and smiled affably.
We're in engineering, lad. Call me Scotty. Okay, Scotty then. This really isn't a good time for a tour. We're in the middle of...
Scott seemed oblivious to what he was saying, or trying to say.
Are you still using cobalt lathanide for the constrictor coils? Yes. But we're running a Phase 7 survey of the Dyson Sphere. I really can't take the time for a tour right now.
Scott turned and looked at him, as if he'd just been offered a cup of antimatter.
I'm not here for a tour, lad. I'm here to help. That's, very kind of you, but, I think we can handle it.
Scott moved to the pool table-like situations monitor. Geordi followed, wondering what the man was up to now.
You know, I'm the only one here who's had any experience with the Dyson Sphere. I could be of some assistance in getting your investigation off on the right foot.
Geordi hesitated. Scott was right. He was the only person alive who'd done any real research on the sphere.
I was a Starfleet engineer for 52 years, Mr. LaForge. I think I can still be of some use.
Geordi bit the bullet.
Fine. We'd appreciate any help you can give us.
Scott fairly beamed.
Good. Let's get to work then, shall we?
And he turned to the situations monitor to do just that. As Geordi joined him, He had a feeling he was going to regret this. Data had spent the last several hours standing at the aft science station. He pointed to his monitor, which displayed a cross-section of the Dyson sphere. Then he looked up at Picard.
Sir, sensor readings indicate the presence of a G-type star at the center of the Dyson sphere. There also appears to be a Class M atmosphere clinging to the interior surface.
Picard nodded.
And there is at least a possibility that the sphere is inhabited. It would appear that way, although we have been unable to find any positive signs of current habitation.
Picard nodded again. The android had seldom seen him so enthralled by a scientific discovery.
Send out a series of Class 4 probes to survey the far side of the sphere, Mr. Data. Perhaps we'll have more luck with them. Aye, sir.
And before another second could elapse, Data had launched the first of the probes. Geordi was leaning forward over the situation's monitor with Captain Scott right beside him. He wondered if a spectrographic analysis had ever taken quite so long. Not that he had any problems with Scott's attitude, but in his efforts to be helpful, the man was getting on everyone's nerves. Geordi tried to focus on the monitor and not on his frustration.
Okay, the lateral sensors are online. Mr. Krauss, adjust the frequency control on the main deflector dish. It's out of sync with
Laddie, you need to phase lock the warp fields within 3% or they'll become unstable.
Reluctantly, Geordi turned to Scott.
What?
Here, I'll show you. You see, the warp field is...
But no sooner had Scott touched the controls than the monitor table suddenly sounded an alarm. The man looked around helplessly. Moving quickly, Geordi corrected the situation.
I do not understand.
We use a 5-phase auto-containment field now. It's meant to operate above 3%.
Scott seemed rattled, but only for a moment.
Oh, well, that would make all the difference, would it not?
Commander LaForge.
Geordi turned in response to Bartel's call. She and two other engineers were working on the darkened warp core.
We're nearly done with the recalibration, Commander. We can restart the engines in 10 minutes.
Scott smiled to himself.
Speaking of restarting the engines, I remember a time when the old Enterprise was spiraling in towards Psi 2000. The captain, Kirk, that is, wanted to try a cold start of the warp engine, but I told him it was impossible without a proper phase lock. It would take at least 30 minutes. I said, in fact...
As Scott went on with his story, undaunted by the flagging attention of those around him, someone stuck a pad with a progress report in front of Geordi's face. He took it, studied it, tried valiantly to concentrate, but he couldn't quite block out Scott's monologue.
Well, you cannot change the laws of physics, I told him. But of course, he would not listen. So I had to come up with a brand new engine startup routine.
With an effort, Geordi forced himself to focus on the first line of the report. He frowned. The alpha band radiation was pretty high. He made a notation on the pad. They would have to run a complete...
Mr. LaForge, your dilithium crystals are about to fracture.
Geordi looked up. The older man had moved off toward the warp core again, and this time he'd opened the dilithium chamber to examine the crystals. Thrusting the pad back at the person who'd given it to him, Geordi hurried over to the warp core. As he shut the dilithium chamber door, he elicited a startled look from Scott.
Laddie, do you know what you're...
Geordi's patience was starting to wear thin. His retort came out terser than he intended.
We recomposite the crystals while they're still within the articulation frame.
Scott looked puzzled.
Aye, that would save a lot of time, but how do you manage to...
That did it. Geordi had tried. He really had. But it was absolutely impossible to humor Scott and still get anything done.
Mr. Scott, please. I'd like to explain everything, really, but the captain wants the spectrographic analysis done by 1300 hours. So if you'll excuse me."
With that, he turned his back on the older man and retreated into his office. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Scott watching him for a moment. Then, uninvited, Scott entered the office and moved quickly to Geordie's side.
"Would you mind, a little advice, laddie?"
Geordie minded a lot, but he held his tongue, hoping that once Scott gave it to him, he'd leave him alone.
"Starship captains are like children, lad. They want everything their way. The secret is to give them what they need, and not what they want."
Scott's attitude was completely contrary to Geordie's training.
"Captain Scott, I told the bridge I'd have that analysis done in an hour."
Scott grinned.
"And how long will it really take you?"
Geordie was the one who was puzzled now.
"It'll take me an hour."
The older man seemed shocked.
"You didn't tell him how long it was really going to take you, laddie." "Oh, laddie. You've got a lot to learn if you want them to think of you as a miracle worker. Take it from me, you've got to—"
Every man has his threshold, a line beyond which he can tolerate no more. Geordie had just reached his. He rounded on Scott.
"Look, sir, I've tried to be patient. I've tried to be polite. But I've got a job to do here, and you're getting in my way."
The last thing he expected was that Scott's own temper would flare, but flare it did. Every engineer in the place turned and stared.
"I'll have you know, I was driving starships while your grandfather was still in diapers. I should think you'd be grateful for a wee bit of help."
Geordie had heard enough. Rather than fan the flames any higher, he turned away from Scott and focused on his monitor, ignoring the man. It was a mistake. Scott's voice waxed even louder for a last barrage.
"Then I'll leave you to your work, Mr. Lafarge."
And with that, the man stormed out of engineering. As Geordie watched him go, he decided he could have handled the incident a whole lot better. Not so long ago, Scott's quarters had seemed so spacious he didn't know what to do with them. Now, as he paced from one bulkhead to the other and back again, they felt too small.
"In the way. Used to be engineers had a wee bit of respect for one another. Used to matter if a man spent his whole life in the bowels of a ship. What do you want?"
Scott wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it wasn't what he got. As the door slid aside, it revealed one of the loveliest brunettes he had ever seen.
"Is this a bad time?" No."
He extended his hand to her.
"Captain Montgomery Scott at your service. What can I do for you?"
She took his hand and grasped it firmly.
"Deanna Troy, ship's counselor. And actually I'm here to see if there's anything I can do for you."
Scott didn't quite know what to make of that. But his visitor was much too pretty to dismiss out of hand. He offered her a seat, then took one himself.
"Oh, thank you kindly for your concern, lass, but I'm set for now. The quarters are more than adequate, and the replicator, that's a wonder."
Scott smiled at her. She smiled back. But he still didn't know why she was here. And maybe, he mused, he didn't care.
"I'm glad you're comfortable, Captain, but I was actually more interested in how you feel." "How I feel, lass?" "Yes. It would be perfectly normal to feel disoriented, confused, or even frightened, following the kind of experience you've just had."
Scott still didn't get it.
"I suppose it's been, a mite bewildering, aye. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about what's happened over the last 75 years. If you wish, I can show you how to access some of our historical records. Maybe help you discover what happened to your family and your friends.
Scott recoiled at the suggestion, surprising even himself. Family? Friends?
Oh, I do not think I'm ready for that just yet. It's a hard thing to come to grips with. I mean, when everybody you once knew is probably...
His voice trailed off as he suddenly realized what tone this conversation was taking. He regarded Troy with suspicion.
Pardon me for asking, love, but what exactly is a ship's counselor? I'm here to watch over the emotional well-being of our crew, and of course, that of our guests as well.
Scott felt his eyes narrowing.
And you're an officer? Yes. They started assigning counselors to starships about 40 years ago, when they realized that the pressures of extended space travel...
You're a psychologist.
Troy seemed a bit taken aback.
Among other things, yes. As I said, I'm here to make sure...
LaForge sent you here, didn't he? I may be old, but I'm not crazy.
You misunderstand, Captain Scott. Geordie didn't send me, and I know you're not crazy.
Scott got to his feet, annoyed at the whole affair. What had started out as something pleasant was turning into just another form of humiliation.
You're damned right. And since we're in agreement on that point, you should know that I do not need a ship's counselor, or a psychologist, or whatever else you might be. I know what I need, and it's not here.
For a moment, Troy looked as if she might try to convince him otherwise. Then she must have thought better of it, because she rose from her seat.
I hope you'll come to feel differently, Captain Scott. In the meantime, I'll be available if you decide you want to see me again.
Scott harumphed. Not bloody likely, he mused, as he watched her exit his quarters. Of all the nerve to even suggest that he, Montgomery Scott, might need a psychologist, a blasted head shrinker. Hadn't he been through more harrowing experiences across the length and breadth of this galaxy than there were people on this Enterprise D? And hadn't he managed to keep mind and body together through it all? As soon as he was sure Troy was gone, Scott emerged into the corridor himself. He didn't know exactly where he was going, nor did he care. He just had to walk to get his blood pumping, to figure things out. As he negotiated a curve in the corridor, he couldn't help but notice the looks he was getting from those around him. Did they know about him? Had they heard? And were they going to offer him some advice too? Some 24th century psychological gobbledygook? Scott was so busy avoiding the gazes of the crew that he almost overlooked a very strange-looking specimen, one with golden eyes and the palest of skin tones. Initially, he'd thought the individual was just an alien, a member of a race that had joined the Federation in the 75 years since he'd been away. But some sixth sense told him otherwise. This was an artificial life form, an android, and it was wearing a Starfleet uniform with a lieutenant's pips on the collar. This construct was an officer on the Enterprise. First Klingons, and now this. Intrigued, Scott did an about-face and caught up with the android. Immediately, those golden eyes slid in his direction.
May I be of assistance, sir?
Scott chuckled. It even sounded artificial. Its speech patterns were too precise, too devoid of emotion to have come from a living pair of vocal cords.
May you be of assistance?
Aye, he thought. You can assist me in twisting your bloody head off so I can get a peek down your neck to see what makes you tick. But he didn't express the sentiment out loud. The android tilted his head to one side.
You are Captain Scott?
So, it knew him. But then, if it was an officer on this ship, it would have been its business to know such things.
Right you are, lad. And who may you be? My name is Data. I am an android. I can tell. I've seen my share of androids, you know. Nonetheless, you did not expect to see an android serving as an officer on the Enterprise, did you?
Scott looked at Data. Perceptive, wasn't he?
Something like that. So, how did you come to be an officer here? Were you built for the purpose? Does every ship have an android aboard these days?
It was a chilling thought. Machines had no business being in charge of starships. They'd proven that 100 years ago, the time Starfleet inflicted the M5 unit on them.
I am the only android presently serving in Starfleet, nor was I created to do so. I was designed and built by Dr. Noonien Sung, a cyberneticist who had no idea that I would one day become an officer on a starship. As for my joining the Enterprise, my career path was not unusual. Like anyone else, I first attended Starfleet Academy and served in lesser capacities on various other vessels.
Scott nodded. There was something strangely likable about this mechanical man, and he still had lots of questions about the warp engines, the transporter units, the phaser banks, the sensor array, and, of course, about Data himself. Scott put his hand on the android's shoulder.
I'd like to speak to you sometime at greater length, Mr. Data. I dinna suppose you'll be getting off duty any time soon. As a matter of fact, sir, I am off duty right now. Are you now? Splendid. Then maybe there's some place we can chew the fat a bit.
The android looked at him, his golden eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then, abruptly, he seemed to understand.
Chew the fat. Converse. Engage in discussion. I would like that, and I believe I have an appropriate venue in mind. It is called 10 Forward.
Scott had never heard of the place. He assumed it was a lab of some kind, but then that didn't really matter, did it? After all, they were going there to exchange information, not to swap tall tales over a bottle of Saurian brandy. Data had barely escorted Captain Scott into the 10 Forward lounge before he knew he had made the right decision. It was obvious from the way Scott rubbed his hands together that he felt right at home here.
Why did you now tell me you have a tavern on board, Mr. Data? You did not ask. Oh, Mr. Data. I had my doubts about you, I must admit. But you're nothing like the androids I used to know. Here now, that looks like the bar. What do you say we belly up to it?
Without waiting for an answer, he took the second officer by the arm and pulled him in the necessary direction. As they sat down on neighboring stools, a waiter came over to them.
May I help you, sir? Aye, lad. Scotch. Neat. And you, Commander? I will have the same.
Scott gazed at him with new admiration.
That a boy, Mr. Data. Though I would nae have figured you for a Scotchman. I am not a Scotchman. In fact, this is the first time I have ever placed such an order. Is that so? Well, now, you're in for a most pleasant surprise.
A few seconds later, the waiter brought them their drinks. Scotch was an amber-colored beverage, the android noted, and as his companion requested, it had been served without ice in short, squat glasses.
Thank you, lad. I'm forever indebted to you. Bottoms?
Suddenly, with the glass halfway to his lips, Scott seemed to notice something amiss. He held his drink up to the light and inspected it. Then, shrugging, he turned to Data.
Oh, well, any port in a storm, eh? What in blazes is this stuff? Are you trying to poison me?
The waiter returned. Is something wrong, sir?
I'll say something's wrong. You didn't bring me what I asked for.
The waiter looked confused. Didn't you order scotch, sir?
Aye, that I did, lad.
But that's what I brought you. Scotch. Scott leaned closer to the man.
Laddie, I was drinking scotch about 100 years before you were born, and I can tell you one thing for certain. Whatever this is, it is most definitely not scotch.
Seeing that the waiter was at a loss, Data intervened.
I believe I may be of some assistance. You see, Captain Scott is unaware of the existence of synthahol.
The older man turned to him.
Synthahol? What in the bleeding blazes is that?
It is an alcohol substitute. Synthahol simulates the appearance, smell, and taste of alcohol, but its intoxicating effects can be dismissed in humanoids with a mental effort.
Scott didn't look happy.
Synthetic scotch and synthetic commanders. I'm beginning to hate the 24th century.
Suddenly, there was someone else behind the bar.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Data and his companion turned at the same time, tracing the voice to its source.
Guinan.
In the flesh, Mr. Data. She turned to Captain Scott.
I don't believe we've been introduced. You are Montgomery Scott.
The woman eyed him.
Of course, the fellow they fished out of the Janolan. One and the same, lass, though I'm starting to wonder if it was worth the trouble.
Guinan smiled placidly.
I don't think you mean that, Montgomery Scott. I think you've been saying a lot of things you don't mean.
Scott looked at her, narrow-eyed.
Do not tell me that you're another one of those counselors.
No, I'm not one of those. I'm the person who runs this place.
I see. Then you're the one responsible for serving that synthahoozes instead of real scotch. Let me tell you something, lassie. I was drinking scotch about 100 years before you were born. I doubt it.
Scott hadn't expected that response.
I beg your pardon.
You weren't drinking scotch 100 years before I was born. And for that matter, neither was your great-great-grandfather. But of course, that's another story entirely. In any case, since you obviously don't care for what we're serving you here...
Walking around to the back of the bar, she bent down and reached for something. When she came up again, she had a very old, dusty bottle full of a dusky green liquid. With a flourish, she placed it next to a clean glass on the bar's polished surface.
I keep a, shall we say, limited supply of non-synthaholic beverages behind the bar. Perhaps this one will be more to your liking, Captain.
Scott considered the bottle, then Guinan, and then the bottle again. Curious, Data picked it up, removed the cap, and sniffed the contents.
What is it?
Data told Scott the only thing he knew for certain.
It is green.
Scott regarded the bottle again and shrugged.
Well, I guess that's good enough for me.
Scott was standing just outside the doors of a holodeck. He was still carrying the bottle of green liquor and the glass from 10 forward. He activated the bulkhead computer terminal.
Please enter program.
My friend the android said that you could show me my old ship.
Insufficient data. Please quantify parameters.
The Enterprise. Show me the bridge of the Enterprise, you chattering piece of...
There have been 5 Federation ships with that name. Please specify by registry number.
NCC 1701. No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Scott took a step toward the strange interlocking doors of the holodeck, and a moment later, as if by magic, found himself on the bridge of his old ship, Kirk's old ship, its monitors blinking and flashing to beat the band. For a second or two, as he moved to a spot beside the captain's chair, Scott felt as if he'd come home. Going over to his old station just to one side of the turbolift, he turned and took a look around, and was unexpectedly depressed. There was nobody here. Nobody at all. It didn't seem right to be alone on a place that had once been such a hive of activity. Without Spock and McCoy exchanging barbs and the captain laughing up his sleeve at them, the Enterprise was like a ghost ship. Scott poured himself a stiff drink, trying to shake his feelings of melancholy. Lifting his glass, he saluted the people who weren't there.
Here's to you, lads.
Suddenly, the holodeck doors opened and admitted a starship captain. A captain of the Enterprise, in fact, but not Kirk. It was Captain Picard. Picard smiled apologetically.
I hope I'm not interrupting. I was just coming off duty and I wanted to see how you were doing.
Scott held out his bottle of liquor.
Have a drink with me, Captain?
For a moment, Picard gazed at the bottle full of green liquid, as if weighing his tolerance for it.
Why not? Computer, I would like a glass, one like Captain Scott's.
Instantly, there was a glass in the captain's hand. He extended it meaningfully toward Scott, and the older man filled it. The contents caught the light and shimmered.
I got it in your 10 forward lounge. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but I'd be careful with it if I were you. It has a real...
Scott's voice trailed off as Picard suddenly threw back the drink in a single fluid motion. Nor did it have the effect Scott expected. In fact, it seemed to have no effect at all. Picard smiled at him.
Aldebaran whiskey, Captain Scott. Who do you think gave that bottle to Guinan in the first place?
Scott felt the laughter bubble up inside him, and he had no reason not to let it out. Lord knew he'd done little in the way of laughing since he left the 23rd century behind. Picard took another look at the antiquated bridge.
Constitution class. Aye, you're familiar with it.
The captain nodded.
There's one at the Fleet Museum. This is your Enterprise, then? Aye, one of them. I actually served on 2 ships with that proud name. This was the first one, though. The one I spent the most time aboard. She was also the first ship I ever served on as an engineer. You know, I shipped out aboard 11 vessels in my career, but this is the only one I ever think about. The only one I ever really miss. That's a funny thing, is it not?
Picard's eyes glazed over for a moment, as if he was staring at something very far away.
Funny thing indeed.
Scott filled their glasses again and leaned back in his chair.
What was the first ship you ever served on, as captain, I mean?
Picard chuckled.
It was called the Stargazer. You say it like an incantation.
The captain shook his head.
There was nothing magical about it, I assure you. The Stargazer was an overworked, underpowered vessel that was always on the verge of flying apart. In every measurable way, my Enterprise is a superior ship. And yet, there are times when I miss that cramped little bridge.
Scott beamed. Here was a man who was very much like him, who could understand what he was going through.
Aye, it's like the first time you fall in love. You didn't ever love a woman quite the way you did that first one.
He raised his glass.
A toast to the Enterprise and the Stargazer. Old girlfriends we'll never see again.
Clinking glasses, they drank up. Drawing a satisfied breath, Picard turned again to his companion.
And while we're on the subject of ships, what do you think of the Enterprise D? She's a beauty for certain. With a good crew, too.
Picard looked at him.
But when I was here, I could tell you the speed we were travelling by the wee shivering in the deck plates. On your ship, half of the time, I cannot seem to tell up from down.
Suddenly, Scott was enveloped by a great sense of sadness, of loss. He turned to his old monitor screen and regarded his reflection in it. He didn't belong here. He was a dinosaur, a relic of some prehistoric age.
You feeling a little disoriented? I'm in the way here, Captain Picard. I feel so bloody useless.
Picard regarded him sympathetically.
75 years. It's a long time, my friend. A big gap. You shouldn't expect to close it in a day. If you'd like to study some of the technical...
Scott shook his head.
I'm not 18, Captain. I cannot start over again like a raw cadet. You need not start over. Not entirely.
Scott shook his head more vigorously. Getting to his feet, he moved toward the captain's chair, then turned back toward Picard.
There comes a time when a man finds he cannot fall in love again, and he knows it's time to stop. I do not belong on your ship, Captain. I belong on Jim Kirk's Enterprise, where I had a purpose.
He used his glass to indicate the entirety of the bridge.
This is not real. It's a computer-generated fantasy, and I'm just an old man, living in his memories of days gone by.
For a moment, Picard looked as if he was going to continue to argue otherwise. But he refrained. Looking up at the computer grid somewhere above him, Scott called out,
Computer, shut this bloody thing off. It's high time I acted my age.
Instantly, the old bridge vanished, leaving the two men on the stark, empty holodeck. Scott harumphed at the sight of the yellow-on-black grid. So this was what a dream looked like after all the trappings were stripped away. It made him feel even emptier inside than before. As Geordi entered the captain's ready room, Picard looked up from his monitor and indicated the chair on the other side of his desk.
Please have a seat, Mr. LaForge. Thank you, sir.
Taking the proffered chair, he waited for the captain to begin.
I have been thinking about our approach to investigating the Janolan, Commander. I understand that her crew conducted an extensive survey of the Dyson sphere before it crashed. That's true. Have we been able to access those records?
The engineer shook his head.
To this point, no. We tried to download the memory core, but it was pretty heavily damaged in the crash. I see. Perhaps Captain Scott could be of use in accessing that material.
Why hadn't Geordi thought of that before? It would have given the man something better to do than clog up the works in engineering.
It's possible, sir. He would know those systems better than any of us.
Geordi reviewed a mental list of everyone in his section and what they were doing.
I'll have Lieutenant Bartell beam down with him. They can get to work on the memory core together. Actually, Commander, I would like you to accompany Mr. Scott.
Geordi looked at him.
Me, sir? This is not an order, Geordi. It is a request, one which you are free to decline.
The engineer smiled.
I wouldn't do that, sir. But just why is it so important to you that I accompany Captain Scott? I've still got quite a few analyses to run, and Bartell is more than qualified.
Picard seemed to gather his thoughts.
Geordi, one of the most important things in a man's life is the need to feel useful. Captain Scott is still a Starfleet officer. I would like him to feel useful again, if that is at all possible.
Finally, Geordi understood what the captain was saying. It was evident in the set of his jaw, in the cast of his eyes. He was speaking not only for Scott, but for himself, for Geordi, for everyone who served on starships and would one day have to give them up.
I'll go with him, Captain. Thank you, Mr. LaForge.
First Officer Riker descended to the command center and deposited himself in his customary place. Data, who was stationed at Ops this shift, turned in his seat to address him.
Commander Riker?
Yes, Data?
Sir, I believe I have found something on the surface of the sphere which could be a communications device.
That got Riker out of his seat again. As he moved to Data's side, the android began to explain.
There is a small antenna array approximately 500,000 kilometers south of our present position. It is emitting low-intensity subspace signals which suggest it may be active.
Can we open a channel, Data?
Not from our present position, sir. The array is currently pointed away from us.
Riker turned to Rager, who was manning the con.
Have you got the coordinates of the array, Ensign?
Rager worked at her control board for a second or two.
Aye, sir. I've got them.
Good. Prepare to take us to a position directly above those coordinates.
As the ensign got to work again, Riker asked himself if this wouldn't be a good time to let the captain know what was going on. When Geordi got to the transporter room, nobody was there but O'Brien. Crossing to the platform, the engineer plunked down the equipment case he had been carrying and shrugged.
Guess I'm early.
O'Brien consulted his control board.
Only by 30 seconds or so. That would make the rest of the away team...
He stopped as Captain Scott walked in through the transporter room doors. His skin had a pale, almost greenish tinge to it, which made the bags under his eyes look even darker by contrast. Geordi caught Scott's attention.
Are you feeling all right?
Scott scowled.
Never get drunk unless you're willing to pay for it the next day. I'll manage. Thanks.
Under the circumstances, Geordi wasn't going to pry. With only a small effort, the older man ascended to the platform. Turning to O'Brien, he nodded to signify his readiness. Geordi picked up his equipment case and moved to stand beside Scott.
All right, Mr. O'Brien. Energize.
Picard regarded the main view screen, which showed a close shot of the surface of the sphere.
What is that circular shape, Data?
The android, who was seated at his ops control, turned to look up at the captain and Riker.
Sensor readings indicate that it is some sort of airlock, sir. Possibly one that leads into the interior of the sphere. Ah, I see. and you said you found a communications array? Aye, sir. It is located on the periphery of the circular pattern at approximately 17 degrees relative.
Picard glanced at the view screen.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Riker smiled.
This looks like the front door, sir. Shall we ring the bell?
The captain regarded his first officer.
Well, let's just do that, number one. Mr. Worf, try to open a channel to the communications array. Aye, sir.
The Klingon set to work at his tactical console. After a few seconds, he turned to the captain.
Nothing yet, sir. Keep at it, Mr. Worf. It may take... Captain!
It was Ensign Rager. She looked up from her con board, her face a mask of alarm.
Intense gravitation emissions on the surface of the sphere, sir. And they're heading this...
Before the ensign could finish her warning, the ship was rocked, and rocked hard. Picard himself was flung clear across the deck, finally coming up against the base of a bulkhead with spine-jarring impact. Resisting the pull of unconsciousness, he got to his knees and looked around. What Picard saw was a twilight version of his bridge. Illumination was down, several consoles had gone out, and his officers, with the exception of Data, had been strewn from one end of the place to the other. Picard frowned.
Red alert! Captain Picard.
It was Data, still sitting at his station, as if he'd been nailed down.
We have been caught in some type of tractor beam, sir. It is drawing us down to the sphere's outer surface.
By then, Riker had pulled himself back into his seat in the command center. He turned to Rager.
Get us out of here, Ensign. Impulse engines back full.
Rager shook her head.
I can't, sir. We've lost main power, and our auxiliary power is down to 20%.
Picard considered the irony. They'd come to rescue the Janolan, but now they themselves needed rescue. Riker barked another command.
Run the impulse engines off auxiliary. If we can't back off, let's try to slow down.
But it was too late for that. The captain could feel it in his bones. As they approached the surface of the Dyson sphere, their rate of descent was actually increasing. The sphere was looming closer, closer. And then, as if by divine decree, the thing's metal skin started to part. At first, it was just a hairline crack. Then it became something considerably larger. Riker stood as if to get a better look at the view screen.
Data was right. It's some kind of hatch. Indeed, number one.
A blaze of light shot out at them, blinding them with its yellow-white brilliance. Shielding his eyes, the captain realized what it was. The sun at the center of the construct. The star that the makers of the sphere had captured and shut off from the rest of the universe. Worf glared at the screen, his eyes wild with apprehension and fury.
The beam is too strong. We can't resist it.
Data was the perfect counterpoint to the Klingons' intensity.
It is not just one tractor beam, sir. There are 6 of them.
The captain could see them now. A half-dozen faint tentacles of light emanating at intervals from the somber and featureless lip of the hatch, inexorably drawing the Enterprise to its fate. Worf cursed beneath his breath.
We're being pulled inside.
And so they were. They were hurtling toward the mighty hatch, falling into a hole that was gaping wider and wider to consume them, and there was nothing they could do about it. Nothing. Gradually, the stars disappeared, and the sky turned a bluish green. But they were still plunging headlong toward the center of the sphere and its captive sun. Riker tried to assess the situation calmly and objectively, but it wasn't easy. The impulse engines were struggling mightily against the forces that had pulled them in. The ship trembled with the effort, lights flickering on the bridge as engineering greedily sucked up what little power they had left. Ensign Rager glanced at him. There were beads of sweat on her forehead.
Auxiliary power failing, Commander. Hull temperature approaching maximum tolerance levels.
Data turned to him as well.
We are passing through the interior atmosphere.
Picard frowned.
Ray shields.
Worf shook his head.
Power unavailable, sir. Hull temperature now critical.
Data turned back to his controls.
The resonance frequency of the tractor beams is incompatible with our power systems. Warp and impulse relays have been overloaded. I am attempting to compensate.
Picard frowned.
How long will it take, Commander? Difficult to say, Captain. It depends on how extensively the circuits have been damaged.
Picard looked at his first officer. Riker looked back. They both knew that Data's efforts would prove futile. Even if he managed to reroute the connections, they didn't have the engine power to fight the sphere's tractor beams. Riker felt a drop of sweat roll down the side of his face. Damn, he thought. It was getting hot in here, wasn't it? Though it was nothing compared to the temperatures in that furnace of a sun dead ahead. There had to be something they could do, Riker thought. Hadn't they been in impossible positions before, and hadn't they always managed to somehow get out of them? The Enterprise shuddered violently, but this time, Riker was better prepared. He was able to grab onto his monitor and anchor himself. He turned to the view screen, hoping he'd get some clue as to what had happened, and he wasn't disappointed. The blue-green sky had faded away, replaced by a clearer view of the captive star. Worf's voice cut through the other talk on the bridge.
We've cleared the atmosphere. Hull temperature dropping back to safety levels.
Pulling down on the front of his tunic, the captain crossed to the command center and came to stand beside Riker.
We're still headed for the sun. Suggestions, number one? What the?
The exclamation came from Rhaegar. The first officer looked at her.
Something, Ensign?
Rhaegar shook her head in disbelief.
The tractor beams have released us, sir. We're free.
Riker checked it out on his monitor. Sure enough, there was no longer any evidence of the sphere's tractor beams.
Hold position here, Ensign, at least until we can get our bearings.
Picard turned to his second officer.
Full sensor sweep, Mr. Data. Where are we? Approximately 90 million kilometers from the star's photosphere, sir. Sensors record.
Suddenly, Rhaegar broke in.
Sir, the inertial motion from the tractor beams is still carrying us forward.
Riker exchanged glances with the captain as he descended to the con. Rhaegar was shaking her head.
The impulse engines are offline, and the maneuvering system's shorted out. I can't stop our forward momentum, sir.
Data confirmed it.
The inertial motion imparted by the tractor beams is carrying us directly toward the star.
Suddenly, they were back on the firing line. Geordi watched as Scott shook his head.
Come on. Do not give me a hard time now.
He was talking to an open computer panel in the op center of the Janolan, trying to coax the system into working. But despite his bantering tone, Scott didn't seem to have his heart in it. He was missing the fire that had made him such a pain in the neck back in engineering. It didn't take an empath to see that he'd been demoralized. Geordi had meant to apologize to Scott as soon as they boarded the Janolan, but there was something in the man's demeanor that said it actually might have made him feel worse.
Here we go.
Scott turned to Geordi.
The primary computer database should be online now. Give it a try, Commander.
Geordi made some adjustments and took another look at the readout on his diagnostic unit. A couple of lights flashed on the face of the device.
Okay. I've got 3 access lines to the central core now.
Geordi frowned, wishing he had better news.
But still no data.
Damn. I thought I had it that time.
Thinking for a moment, Scott applied himself to the open panel again.
Here, maybe this'll do it. Just a second there. Let her rip.
Geordi did as he was instructed. there was no improvement.
Nothing, Laforge? Nothing yet?
Scott looked disgusted.
Bunch of old, useless garbage.
Geordi was a little surprised by the remark.
What? I said it's old, Mr. Laforge. The controller can't handle the interface of your new power converter. This equipment was designed for a different era. Now it's just a lot of junk.
He was talking about more than just the equipment, Geordi realized. He was talking about himself.
Oh, I don't know. Looks to me like some of it has held together pretty well.
Scott regarded him disbelievingly.
Come on, lad, it's a century out of date. How can you use something so obsolete?
Contemptuously, Scott slammed the panel closed. Geordi wanted to reach out to the man in some way. He considered the console he was working on and ran his hand over it.
That's interesting, Captain Scott, because I was just thinking that a lot of these systems haven't changed much in 75 years.
Scott was barely paying attention. Geordi moved over to the transporter controls.
Aside from a few minor improvements, this transporter is virtually identical to the ones we use on the Enterprise. The subspace radio and sensors operate on the same basic principles, and impulse engine design hasn't changed much in almost 200 years. If it weren't for the structural damage, this ship could still be in service today.
Scott considered what Geordi was saying.
I may be so, but when you can build a ship like your Enterprise, who'd want to pilot an old bucket like this one?
Geordi shrugged.
The Enterprise has her strengths, but she's also got her weaknesses. Fix that engine, and I bet this ship could run circles around her at impulse speeds. Hell, just because something's old doesn't mean you have to throw it away.
They looked at each other for a moment. Geordi could feel a bond forming between them. Maybe even a friendship. Scott was the one who finally dissolved the moment, moving back to the computer console.
We used to have something called a dynamic mode converter. I do not suppose you'd have something like that in your fancy new Enterprise, would you?
Geordi thought about it.
I haven't seen one of those in a long time, but I might have something similar back on the ship.
He hit his communicator emblem.
Laforge to Enterprise.
No one answered. Geordi hit the emblem again.
Laforge to Enterprise. Come in, please.
Still nothing. How strange. Scott darted him a look of concern as Geordi moved to the sensor console.
Interference, lad. No, unfortunately.
A moment later, the sensor's monitor showed Geordi the astounding truth.
Damn. They're gone.
As Picard glared at the view screen, Data's voice was like the knell of doom.
We will enter the sun's photosphere in 3 minutes. Helm control still inoperative.
The captive star filled the main view screen as the Enterprise rushed toward it. There had to be a way out of this, Picard told himself. He wouldn't accept defeat, not while he had a brain and some time to use it. Suddenly, it came to him. He turned to Riker, who was at the aft engineering station, where Geordi would have been if he hadn't beamed over to the Janolan.
Number 1, are the maneuvering thrusters online?
Though Riker's expression said he failed to see what the captain was getting at, he worked furiously at the controls. After a second or two, he nodded.
I've got 30% power on the starboard thrusters, 15% on the port thrusters, but it won't be enough to break our inertia. I agree, Number 1, but it may be enough to put us in orbit and hold our distance from the star.
For a brief moment, Riker smiled. Then he turned to the monitor again, preparing himself for what was ahead. The captain turned to his android second officer.
Mr. Data, calculate the minimum change in our trajectory necessary to avoid the star. A 20-degree turn will allow us to establish a safe orbit around the star.
The captain whirled toward the engineering station.
Did you hear that, number one? I did, sir. 20 degrees.
But even a 20-degree variation would be a prodigious task under these conditions, and if they managed only 19 degrees, there would be nothing left of them but cinders. With that in mind, Picard gave the next order.
Port thrusters ahead, full. Starboard, back, full.
As Riker bent to his task, the captain glanced at the view screen. The star was terribly close. He could almost feel its fury on his face. Data looked to Picard.
Our flight path is changing, sir. 10.7 degrees to starboard. Not enough to clear the photosphere.
The captain saw Riker looking up at the intercom grid.
Bridge to engineering. Lieutenant Bartell, divert all power from auxiliary relay systems to the maneuvering thrusters.
Intent on his monitors, Data nodded approvingly.
Our angular deflection is increasing. Now at 15 degrees, 18 degrees. Turn now at 20.1 degrees.
Picard looked at the view screen. Would it be enough? And then, as the captain held his breath, the giant view screen image of the star finally shifted to the left, then more, and still more, as the ship managed to turn away from the sun's inferno. Finally, they passed the outer edges of the photosphere, if only just. There was a collective sigh of relief. In front of Picard, Rager's shoulders relaxed.
We're in orbit, Captain. Holding at 150,000 kilometers above the photosphere.
Riker headed for the turbolift.
I'll see about getting main power back online, sir. Very well, number one.
As Riker departed for engineering, the captain took his seat and leaned back into it.
Mr. Data, begin a scan of the interior surface for life forms. I want to know who brought us here, and why. Aye, sir.
The captain wished he could get word to the Janolan somehow, but Geordi and Scott would be all right, at least for the time being. It had been a long time since anyone had attempted to use the sensor controls in the ops center of the transport vessel Janolan. All things considered, they were in remarkably good shape. Working alongside Scott, Geordi pushed the ship's scanners to their limits, but try as he might, he couldn't turn up so much as a blip.
I can't find them anywhere in orbit.
His companion frowned.
No luck here either.
Geordi shook his head.
They wouldn't have just up and left.
Suddenly, Scott's brow furrowed.
You do not suppose they crashed into the sphere the way the Janolan did? No. We'd be picking up background radiation and debris if they had gone down like that. But then, where are they? They couldn't have just vanished. There's another possibility. They could be inside the sphere.
Geordi looked at him. At first blush, it sounded preposterous, ridiculous. But the more he considered it...
Maybe you're right.
Scott seemed certain of it.
No, just maybe. They're in there. That's the only place they could be.
Geordi thought for a moment.
Whatever's happened, we've got to find them. If we can get these engines back online, we could track them by their impulse ion trail. Are you daft, laddie? The main drive assembly's completely shot. The inducers are melted and the power couplings are ruined. We'd need a week just to get started.
Geordi felt the anger building inside him. First, he couldn't get this guy to stand aside, and now he couldn't convince him to help. But before he could say anything, a change came over Scott.
On the other hand, we don't have a week now, do we? So there's no sense crying about it. Come on. Let's see what we can do with that power converter you're so fond of.
Then, turning away from Geordi, Scott made his way toward the engines, leaving the younger man a little surprised. With a bemused look, he followed his predecessor's lead. Picard sat in his command chair and tried to remain patient as his officers worked all around him. Someone had gone to the trouble of drawing them inside this thing. It was up to them to find that someone if they were to have any hope of reopening the hatch and gaining their freedom. Unfortunately, Worf had already analyzed the sphere's composition and discovered it to be composed of carbon neutronium, one of the hardest substances known. Even at full power, they couldn't generate a phaser barrage strong enough to punch a hole in it.
Captain? Yes, Data? Have you got something already? I do, sir. I have completed the bioscan of the interior surface of the sphere. Unfortunately, it appears to be abandoned.
The captain frowned. So much for getting any help from the sphere's builders. It looked like they were very much on their own. In the op center of the Janolan, Geordi was lying on his back under a control console. Less than a meter away, Scott was in the same position under a neighboring console. It had been hours since Geordi had agreed to help get the Janolan's engines started, but in that time, he and Scott had made more progress than he would have imagined possible.
All right, lad. Now shunt the deuterium from the main cryo pump to the auxiliary tank.
Geordi poked his head out from under the console.
Scotty, the tank won't hold up under that much pressure.
Scott poked his head out as well.
Where'd you get that idea, laddie? It's in the impulse engine specifications.
Scott grinned.
Regulation 42/15 alpha. Pressure variances in IRC tank storage. That's right.
The older man dismissed it with a wave of his hand.
Forget it. Outroot the bloody thing. A good engineer is always a wee bit conservative, at least on paper. Just bypass the secondary cutoff valve and boost the flow. It'll work. Trust me.
Smiling to himself, Geordi got to his feet and made the necessary adjustments on the console's control panel.
Okay, I'm shunting the deuterium.
A moment passed. 2. If there was going to be a problem in the auxiliary tank, it probably would have manifested itself by now.
Looks like you were right. Well, naturally, lad.
Crawling out from under his own console, Scott cracked his knuckles and with a bit of a flourish, pressed a few buttons.
All right now, if we've done our jobs properly, the engines should be coming back online about now.
For a moment, they watched the display and nothing happened. Then, slowly, console by dead console, the remainder of the op center came to life. Geordi checked his levels.
The auxiliary tank is still holding.
Scott flashed a grin at him and then gestured to the Janolan small command chair.
The bridge is yours, Commander.
Geordi shook his head.
You're the senior officer here. I may be a captain by rank, but I've never wanted to be anything but an engineer. Take the con, Geordi.
Geordi found himself admiring the hell out of Captain Montgomery Scott.
If you insist.
Moving to the command chair, Geordi sat down in it while Scott made his way to the engineering panel.
Okay then, let's get going. We've got a starship to track down.
Picard was standing beside Data, watching the image of the captive star on the main view screen. He shook his head.
Automatic piloting beams, you say? Yes, sir. I believe they were designed to guide ships inside the sphere. And they were triggered by our communications attempt? Precisely. Then the resonant frequency of the beams interfered with the integrity of our main power system, temporarily taking the engines offline. That makes sense. Would you care to hazard a guess as to...
Suddenly, Worf broke into their conversation.
Sir, sensors show a large magnetic disturbance on the star's surface.
Data worked the controls on his console at a speed only he could manage.
It is a solar flare, Captain. Magnitude 12, Class B.
Picard turned to face Worf.
Shields, Lieutenant?
Shields up, sir, but only at 23%.
Picard wanted to see what they were up against.
Magnify, Lieutenant.
Abruptly, the screen showed a huge solar flare reaching out from the star, a flare headed directly toward the Enterprise. The captain felt the muscles in his face drawing tight as Data turned to him.
Sir, the star has entered a period of increasing solar flare activity. In 3 hours, our shields will not be sufficient to protect us. If I may speculate, Captain, such activity might explain why the sphere is devoid of life.
As Data spoke, the flare loomed larger and larger. Someone at one of the aft stations muttered a curse. My sentiments exactly, thought Picard. Scott looked from one monitor to the other. The first one showed a graphic of the ion path they'd been following. The second displayed the section of the Dyson sphere directly below them. Standing beside him, Geordi shook his head.
End of the rainbow, Scotty, and still no pot of gold. No Enterprise.
Scott pointed to his monitor.
Look at the momentum distribution of these ions. It would take an impulse engine at full reverse to put out a signature like that. So wherever they went, they didn't go willingly. That makes sense. Tell you what, I'll search the surrounding space, you scan the surface of the sphere. You've got yourself a deal, laddie.
As Scott worked, he shook his head. He still believed that the Enterprise had vanished inside the sphere. There was no other explanation. But if that was the case, how had it happened? There was no visible means of entry, and without one, his theory, unlike the sphere, had a pretty big hole in it.
Anything, Scotty? Nothing. Just some low-level radiation and a lot of meteor debris.
Suddenly, something caught Scott's eye.
Wait a minute. What's this?
Homing in on a finite portion of the sphere, he brought up a sensor map. And sure enough, the surface of the thing wasn't as smooth and uninterrupted as it had first appeared.
Come here, lad. I've got something here you might want to take a look at.
The younger man moved to peer over Scott's shoulder.
That circular line, Scotty. It looks like some kind of doorway or an entry hatch. Aye. Now look at this.
Working at his control board, Scott imposed the image of the ion trail on the image of the hatch. The trail ended right above the circular line. The two men exchanged a look.
I'll bet you 2 bottles of scotch that the Enterprise is inside that sphere and it entered through that hatch.
Geordi shook his head.
No bet here. The question is, how do we get the door to open for us?
A good question, thought Scott. Together they examined the display. And then Geordi pointed to something.
Look here. This appears to be some kind of communications array.
It looked familiar to Scott.
Aye. We found hundreds of them when we did our initial survey 75 years ago. Did you try hailing them? Sure. That was standard procedure in my day. Not that it did us any good. There was never any answer, and shortly after that, the power coils blew up.
Geordi tapped his fingers on the side of the console.
Hailing is standard procedure today, too. Wait a minute, Scotty. What if these aren't communication arrays? What if they're some kind of remote access terminals, triggered by subspace signals on certain frequencies?
Scott felt a trickle of cold sweat run down his spine.
Frequencies, like our standard ship's hail? Exactly, Scotty. When the Enterprise saw this terminal, they probably did the same thing you did 75 years ago. Opened a hailing frequency. Only this time it triggered something that activated this hatch and pulled the ship inside.
Scott considered the hypothesis.
But why would the Janola not have been pulled inside as well?
He answered his own question.
Ah, of course. Because it was near a hatch. That's right, it wasn't. But you might have activated a similar mechanism, one designed to shunt an incoming vessel to a hatch, except maybe the Janolan wasn't big enough or strong enough to survive the shunt, and its power coils bore the brunt of it. A nice bit of reasoning, laddie. Very nice indeed.
Geordie smiled, but it faded as he remembered the fix they were in.
Let's assume for the moment that we're right. How does that help us help the Enterprise? If we try to open the hatch, we'll be pulled in the same way they were. Aye, lad. That's certainly something to consider.
Suddenly, it came to him.
Then again, maybe we just need to get our foot in the door. I don't get it. All right then, here it is. You see, we trigger the remote terminal with a subspace transmission. If we're far enough away, say 500,000 kilometers, we'll nae have to worry about being pulled inside. Then, when the hatch starts to close again, wham! We rush in and use the Janolan to jam the thing open until the Enterprise can escape.
Geordie looked at him as if the man had gone completely crackers. But Scott was already moving toward his engineering console to put their plan into action.
Scotty, that hatch could crush this ship like an egg. Leave it to me, lad. I can increase the shield strength by running warp power through the relay grid.
Geordie shook his head.
No way. These engines are barely holding together as it is. You push them too hard and they'll explode.
Scott shrugged off the possibility.
They'll hold, lad. Don't you worry about that. I know how to get a few extra gigawatts out of these wee bairns. Scotty, this is suicide. There's got to be something else we can try. Something less, less crazy. Geordie, me lad, I've spent my whole life figuring out how to make crazy things work. I'm telling you, one engineer to another, I can do this.
For a moment, they looked at one another. Scott could almost see Geordie searching his heart for a course of action. Finally, the man in the visor made his decision.
All right, let's do it.
Grinning from one side of his face to the other, Scotty clapped him on the shoulder.
Atta boy, Mr. Lafarge. Welcome to the club.
On the bridge of the Enterprise, Picard steeled himself against the impact of the onrushing solar flare. All around him, his officers did the same. Worf scowled.
Impact in 22 seconds.
The captain stifled a curse. They had survived almost every manner of assault imaginable. They had weathered the most hideous of cosmic phenomena, and yet here they were, helpless in the face of a simple solar flare.
10 seconds, sir.
At the sound of Worf's warning, Picard's teeth grated together.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
As the blossom of flaming plasma exploded against the shields of the Enterprise, the ship was shaken like a leaf in a windstorm. Picard held onto the edge of Data's console, barely keeping his feet. Worf barked out his report.
Shields holding, but down another 15%, sir.
Damn. Another couple of flares like that one, thought Picard, and they'd be down to no shields at all. It was starting to look as if Data's prognosis, grim as it had sounded, was actually too optimistic. Abruptly, the android turned to him.
Sir, helm control has been restored. Impulse power stands at 60%.
Picard nodded. At last, some good news.
Excellent, Mr. Data. Ensign Rhaegar, take us out of here at half impulse. Double our distance from the star. Aye, sir. 300,000 kilometers.
They'd reached their destination in seconds, and at that distance, the captain judged, they would be reasonably safe from the flares, even with their shields impaired. He descended to Data's side.
Now, all we need is a way out of here.
Data looked up at him.
I could conduct a search for another hatch or portal that might still be open. However, the interior surface area of the sphere is more than 10 to the 16th power square kilometers. It would take 7 hours to completely scan the surface.
The ship shook again, though not as badly as before. Apparently, they were still in range of the flares. Picard glanced at the android meaningfully. Data nodded.
I will endeavor to speed up the process, sir.
This was going to be tricky, Geordi told himself. Very tricky. Unfortunately, it was either try Scott's plan or let the Enterprise languish in its spherical prison. Moving on half impulse power, the Janolan crept nearer and nearer to the place where the hatch was supposed to be, if it was a hatch. Geordi consulted his monitor.
We're at 500,000 kilometers.
At the next console over, Scott nodded, playing the controls like a virtuoso. He brought the ship to a dead stop. Geordi took a deep breath. Then, with utmost concentration, he made the necessary preparations for their gamble.
How are the engines? Engines are ready, lad.
The younger man looked at him, cool as a walk in the ether. Either Scott believed in his strategy a lot more strongly than Geordi did, or he was simply out of his mind.
Okay, Mr. Scott. Keep your fingers crossed. Here we go. Open a hailing frequency.
For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, miraculously, a crack opened in the sphere and kept on opening. From around the circumference of the widening doorway, 6 spidery tractor beams reached up into space and searched for a ship. But they found nothing to latch onto, nothing to draw into their web. Geordi tried to open a channel to the Enterprise, but there was too much static. They would have to wait until they were right in the doorway. After what seemed like a long time, the beams shut off. A moment later, the hatch began to slide closed.
That's it, Scotty. Let's go. Full impulse power.
Both of them worked their controls like madmen. Somewhere below their feet, the engines rumbled back into high gear, and seconds later, they were speeding toward the hatch faster than it could shut them out. As the opening diminished, they maneuvered the Janolan into the middle of it and then stopped. Geordi had time to glance at his partner in this mad venture. Scott was smiling. Actually smiling.
Any second now, laddie. Any second.
Suddenly, the ship shuddered. The hatch had encountered the Janolan's deflector shields, and just as Scott had predicted, their shields were stronger. They had indeed gotten their foot in the door. Worf hadn't been paying close attention to the communications monitor on his tactical board, so when the screen lit up to indicate an incoming message, it was something of a surprise. In fact, the Klingon could barely believe what his monitor was telling him.
Captain Picard, there is an incoming audio message. It's Commander LaForge, sir.
LaForge? By all means, Lieutenant, put him through. A moment later, Geordi's voice sang out on the tension-filled bridge.
This is LaForge. Do you read me, Enterprise? We read you, Commander. Go ahead, Geordi.
Geordi hung onto one of the engineering consoles in the Janolan. The ship was shaking like crazy, its shields threatening to buckle on them, its overworked engines roaring to beat the band, despite Scotty's best efforts.
Captain, we're using the Janolan to hold open the hatch at the entrance to the sphere.
What? Did I hear you correctly, Commander?
Geordi nodded, even though the captain couldn't see him.
You did, sir, but our shields won't stand the pressure much longer.
Understood. Ensign Rhaegar, set a course.
Suddenly, one of the panels in the ops center exploded, bathing both Geordi and Scott in a rain of white-hot sparks. Before the younger man knew it, Scott was rushing over to check the damage.
Damn! The plasma intercooler's gone. She's overheating.
Working at his console to contain the problem, Geordi muttered a curse of his own.
I've lost helm control. LaForge to Enterprise.
Geordi, are you all right?
I've been better, sir.
A second panel blew, and then a third. Both of them burst into flames.
Mr. LaForge, what's your status?
Another explosion, louder than the first three. They were losing the battle, and on the verge of losing the war.
Lousy, Captain. We won't be able to move the Janolan out of the way when you arrive.
What are you saying? Picard's voice was breaking up now. Even the communication system was going to pieces. Gagging on the smoke that was filling the ops center at an alarming rate, Geordi managed to get out an answer.
What I'm saying is this. You're going to have to destroy the Janolan in order to get out of there.
Absorbing LaForge's bleak message, Picard turned to his second officer.
Mr. Data, how long will it take us to reach them? With impulse engines operating at 60% power, it will take 1 minute, 40 seconds to reach the entrance.
Captain Scott's voice came over the communications link.
We cannot hold her together any longer, sir. You've got maybe 2 minutes before the engines go critical. Tops.
Picard spoke to the intercom grid.
Commander Riker, I need more speed. We're on it, sir.
Picard felt his fists clenching. Despite Riker's optimistic response, there was only so much he could do down there. It was going to be close. Too close.
Bridge to Transporter Room 3. Stand by to beam 2 from Janolan as soon as we're in range.
Aye, Captain. Standing by.
On the view screen, the star field faded, turned blue with a hint of green. Abruptly, the Enterprise was plummeting through the atmosphere, heading for the distant escape hatch. Once again, their diminished shield capacity left them open to rising temperatures from the friction of re-entry, but not as much as when they had no shields at all. Picard glanced at Worf.
Load photon torpedoes, Lieutenant.
Photon torpedoes loaded and locked on target, Captain.
Picard saw Data turn to glance over his shoulder at him.
We are within transporter range, sir.
The captain felt as if he'd been waiting for that cue forever.
Bridge to transporter room. Energized. Mr. Worf, fire torpedoes.
The Klingon executed the command as quickly as he possibly could. Picard watched the forward view screen as the transport ship, still caught in the hatchway of the Dyson sphere, loomed larger and larger, bathed in bright splashes of phaser fire. For a terrible, gut-wrenching instant, the captain was certain they weren't going to destroy the ship in time. He thought that they were going to plow into her, destroying both vessels and all their occupants. And then, in a sudden blaze of glory, the Janolan exploded. But they weren't out of danger yet, far from it. Because as soon as the Janolan was out of the way, the jaws of the hatch began to come together again. And though the Enterprise was hurtling toward the opening as fast as her damaged engines could propel her, the aperture was already pitifully small. Would they make it? Would they get there before the hatch closed, trapping them inside again, perhaps forever? Picard's eyes narrowed as he watched their window of opportunity dwindle.
Helm. Rail to port. 90 degrees.
The image on the view screen rotated 90 degrees in the opposite direction. The captain's estimate had been a good one. They were now in a position to slip through the ever-narrowing egress. Holding his breath, Picard concentrated on the sliver of star-strewn space that beckoned from beyond their escape hatch, knowing full well it might be the last thing he ever saw. And then suddenly the splinter of an opening was gone, replaced by the familiar sight of the sprawling universe in all its star-pricked glory. Exhaling, the captain pulled down on his uniform front and turned to Data.
That was close, Commander. Too close.
Transporter Chief O'Brien labored at his controls.
Oh, come on. After all you've been through, you can't give up now.
Across the room, up on the transporter platform, the outlines of two men flickered hopefully. O'Brien set his teeth, knowing he had a chance. They were out there somewhere, if only he could reel them in. Ever so carefully, he modulated the gain in the phase transition coils. The images got stronger, and stronger still. He could almost make out details in their clothing, even in their faces.
Steady now, lads. Slow and steady does it.
Finally, the outline stabilized, took on texture, and a moment later, the two men materialized. Laughing, Scott threw an arm around LaForge's shoulders.
There now. That was nice so bad, was it?
Geordie smiled back at him.
I guess it could have been worse, although I think I've had one close transport too many.
Scott's eyes opened wide.
You? How about me? If I never see another transporter, it'll be too soon.
And like a couple of drunken sailors, they staggered off the platform together. O'Brien watched them go. He shook his head and sighed.
Oh, you're welcome, lads. Pleased to be of service.
Geordie grinned as the turbolift compartment echoed with Scott's enthusiasm.
But how did you do it, the captain asked me. And I tell him, sir, I just had the cleanup detail pile every last one of these wee beasties onto the transporter platform. And he looks at me, sort of horrified, sort of the way you're looking now, lad, and says, "But Scotty, you didn't just transport them out into space, did you?" So, I put on an offended expression, and I say, "I'm a kind-hearted man, sir. I gave them a good home." And the captain says, "Where, Scotty? Spit it out now." And I tell him that I gave the beasties to the Klingons. Just before they went into warp, I transported the whole kit and caboodle into their engine room as a wee parting gift.
The younger man shook his head.
You didn't. May I be struck by lightning if I changed a single word of it?
The turbo lift doors opened and Geordie ushered him out.
All right. Now I've got one for you.
As they started down the corridor, he related in broad strokes, of course, the most preposterous story he could think of. It felt good to be telling Scotty a tall tale instead of the other way around.
Oh, come on now, lad. You're pulling an old man's leg.
No, really. This alien space baby, which was about the size of a 4-story building, really thought the Enterprise was its mother. It was suckling power directly from the ship's fusion reactors.
So what did you do? You didn't tell me. You changed the power frequency and soured the milk.
That's right. How did you know?
Scotty shrugged.
Great minds think alike.
They laughed at that. But just seconds later, Scott's smile seemed to fade a bit.
Enjoy these times, Geordie. You're the chief engineer of a starship. It's a time of your life that'll never come again. And once it's gone for good. Not that retirement is so bad, mind you, but I hear the Norpen colony is very quiet this time of year.
Geordie stopped in front of the shuttle bay doors. Scotty stopped too, a little surprised.
I thought you were going to buy me a drink and 10 forward. Didn't you tell me you're withdrawing your offer?
Maybe, but only in favor of a better one.
As the door slid aside, Geordie led the way into the shuttle bay. Consumed with curiosity, Scott followed. He wasn't disappointed either, not a single bit. Picard, Riker, Worf, Dr. Crusher, Troy, and Data were all standing beside a large, gleaming shuttlecraft. The vehicle's space door was open. Stunned, Scott looked it over, then glanced back at his friends.
Does this mean what I think it means? You're going to give me one of your shuttles?
Picard smiled warmly.
Call it, an extended loan. Since you lost your ship while saving ours, it seemed only fair to supply you with another one.
Geordi leaned closer to his fellow engineer.
It's a bit slow, but it'll get you to the Norpan colony, if that's where you really want to go.
Scott considered the ship, and very slowly a change came over his features. He seemed different, rejuvenated, Geordi thought.
Lad, the Norpan colony is where old men go to retire. Maybe I'll end up there someday, but nay, just yet. There's still a lot I want to see. In fact, perhaps I'd best be off. You know, before I get a chance to think twice about it.
Crusher looked at him, obviously disappointed.
So soon? Aye, lass. And dinna be telling me I need to stay and rest up. Any more of this sort of rest and they'll be carrying me out on a stretcher. Though you're still the prettiest physician I ever saw.
A flurry of goodbyes followed. When it was all over, Scotty took LaForge's arm and escorted him out of earshot.
They're a good crew, Geordi, and she's a fine ship, this Enterprise. A credit to her name. But I've always found that a ship is only as good as the engineer who takes care of her. And from what I can see, she could not be in better hands.
Geordi clapped Scott on the shoulder.
Better get a move on.
Scotty nodded.
Aye, lad. Right you are.
It seemed like eons had passed since I kicked the man out of my engineering section, and even longer than that since I stopped him from tampering with that EPS power tap. Scotty had come a long way since we brought him aboard the Enterprise. If I'd been dumped into the next century without warning or preparation, I doubt if I would have adjusted half as well. Getting into the shuttle, my friend Scotty shut the space door behind him. I watched with mixed emotions as he started the engine and gave us all a thumbs-up sign. Then, as Captain Picard himself worked the bay door controls, Scotty nudged the shuttle to the brink of space where an invisible force field separated the air in the shuttle bay from the cold and airless void. I could almost see the look in Scotty's eyes. It was all out there, everything he could ever want. New worlds, new civilizations, new adventures. And someday, I was sure he'd find some of those old friends he'd lost track of, the ones with whom he'd served so long and so well on Jim Kirk's Enterprise. Of course, there was danger and uncertainty and disappointment out there too, but that came with the territory, didn't it? And who knew that territory better than Captain Montgomery Scott? Moments later, the shuttle took off into the star-pricked expanse of space. It got smaller and smaller as it gradually pulled away from us, finally banking and setting a course for only its pilot knew where. But I was happy, very happy for my friend Scotty. Captain Picard was right, I thought. Men need a sense of purpose in their lives, a sense of going somewhere, a sense of moving forward. And once again, Scotty had that sense of purpose. He'd been through his share of tribulations since we pulled him out of that transporter loop on the Janolan. He'd had to make some pretty big adjustments. But in the long run, I had a feeling Scotty was going to like the 24th century.